sold to the highest bidder. Gabrielle Laurent stood in the center of the St. Regis ballroom, the emerald fabric of her dress catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. Her heart raced as the bidding climbed higher, each paddle raised around the room a reminder of the stakes. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, her deep brown skin glowing under the spotlight. Across the room, Alexander Sterling lifted his paddle, his blue eyes fixed on her. Tall and sharply dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit, he exuded control, a quiet authority that made her pulse quicken. The auctioneer's voice cut through the murmurs. $150,000. Gabrielle's chest tightened. The sum could save her grandmother's restaurant, the place that had shaped her childhood. Yet standing here, she felt exposed, as if she were being appraised like an object rather than a person. The gavel came down. Sold. The room seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Gabrielle's gaze met Alexander's across the crowd, and a current passed between them. How did a woman who had promised herself she could never be bought find herself on an auction block? And what would this one night cost her beyond the price tag? Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Tomorrow's story will challenge expectations and explore choices that can change everything. Let's begin. Gabrielle Laurent's earliest memories were steeped in the smells and sounds of Fulton Street in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Her grandmother's soul food restaurant hummed with life from early morning until late evening, the air rich with collard greens, cornbread, and the sweet undertone of fried chicken. Children laughed as they waited for school buses. Neighbors exchanged news over counters, and jazz filtered through open windows from a nearby record store. Gabrielle spent hours at the front of the restaurant, taking orders, wiping tables, and absorbing the rhythm of the community that had raised her. Her mother, a nurse at Kings County Hospital, worked double shifts. Gabrielle remembered the exhaustion in her mother's eyes, the quiet pride in her voice when she returned home, still carrying the weight of other people's lives. From them, Gabrielle inherited a fierce sense of responsibility and a belief that hard work could carry you further than luck ever could. School became her refuge, and later, Columbia University became the proving ground for her intellect and ambition. She graduated summa cum laude in art history, and even as the city's elite galleries beckoned, she refused to compromise her values. Gabrielle carved out a space for herself in Manhattan's competitive art world, consulting and authenticating works, often championing artists whose voices were overlooked. Her brownstone in Fort Greene was both home and gallery, walls lined with paintings, sculptures, and photographs that told stories rarely seen in the glossy art magazines of Midtown. Yet life's pressures mounted. Developers had targeted her grandmother's building, threatening the restaurant's future. Medical bills from her mother's recent illness drained savings she had carefully built. Each day felt like a negotiation between survival and principle. Gabrielle faced these realities with determination, though the weight of responsibility was constant, a quiet companion to her achievements. Across the city, Alexander Sterling inhabited a world that was almost the opposite of Gabrielle's, though equally intense. He had built his empire from his Stanford dorm room, creating a fintech platform that had transformed investment access for millions. By the time he was 30, he was a billionaire. His Tribeca penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower, with walls of windows revealing a cityscape he knew intimately but often felt detached from. His offices in the Woolworth building combined historic elegance with the cutting-edge technology his company relied on. Despite wealth and influence, Alexander's life had been marked by caution and solitude. A failed engagement left him wary of intimacy. Trust had never come easily. He had seen his father's partners betray their family business, and friends had abandoned them when financial tides shifted. The lesson Alexander internalized was simple: rely on yourself. Emotional connections were fragile, and wealth, as isolating as it could be, provided control he hadn't found elsewhere. His sister Caroline, however, refused to let him remain so insulated. She had insisted he attend the charity auction at the St. Regis, highlighting it as both a social obligation and a chance to connect with causes he had supported financially but never experienced in person. Alexander had initially resisted, claiming prior commitments, a headache, any excuse that would allow him to avoid the ballroom's polished expectations. Caroline, undeterred, had arranged everything and made it clear that attendance was non-negotiable. The evening arrived, and Alexander found himself standing quietly at the edge of the Astor ballroom, glass of scotch in hand, scanning the crowd. He was surrounded by wealthy donors and professionals, all performing carefully crafted versions of themselves. The auction was underway, paddles moving in calculated increments, the murmur of ambition filling the room. Gabrielle, under the spotlight, was the center of attention. Her heart pounded as bids rose for her auction package. She reminded herself why she had agreed to participate. The money could secure her grandmother's restaurant, and by extension, preserve a legacy she refused to lose. Yet she also felt a strange vulnerability, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the formalities of her professional life. Her identity, her skills, her years of preparation, they were now quantified in a number being shouted across a crowded ballroom. Across the room, Alexander lifted his paddle. Something about Gabrielle's presence held him, captured more than his curiosity or his ego. She was unlike the others, confident without artifice, passionate without pretense. The bids climbed higher, the competitive energy of the room pressing against his usual calm. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about investments, acquisitions, or markets. He was thinking about the woman whose integrity and intensity had drawn his attention before a single word had passed between them. When the gavel finally came down and the package was declared sold, Gabrielle felt the weight of both relief and unease. Her eyes found Alexander's across the room, and in that instant, the air seemed to hold a quiet promise. Their worlds had collided, not by accident, but by a series of choices and circumstances neither had fully controlled. One glance was enough to acknowledge it, though neither could yet define the connection forming between them. Backstage, the moment of introduction arrived. Gabrielle extended her hand with measured professionalism. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for your support. I hope the tour proves worthwhile." Alexander's expression softened as he replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "I have a feeling it will. Call me Alexander." Neither of them could have anticipated the journey that single evening would begin, a journey of discovery, challenges, and questions about worth, autonomy, and partnership. The auction was only the starting point, and the choices they would face next promised to test both heart and conviction. Alexander followed Gabrielle down the cobblestone streets of Chelsea, the gallery's large windows revealing bursts of color and texture that contrasted sharply with the city outside. He had walked past these streets countless times, but never like this. Her knowledge and enthusiasm transformed each display into a story rather than decoration. She stopped in front of a mixed-media piece combining African textiles with abstract layering of paint and metal. Gabrielle's eyes softened as she explained, "This artist grew up in a neighborhood like mine." She was told her voice didn't belong in galleries, that her story wasn't universal. But she persisted. She turned to Alexander. "Worth isn't determined by what others are willing to pay. It exists regardless of market recognition." He studied the work, then her, and felt a subtle shift in perspective. For years, he had measured value by returns, by prestige, by public acclaim. Now he realized he had overlooked the intrinsic significance of effort, perspective, and identity. Her words lingered, making him question how much of his life had been ruled by external validation. They moved through galleries, Gabrielle highlighting emerging Black artists, each introduction a mix of professional insight and personal vulnerability. She spoke of risks taken, opportunities denied, and the courage required to remain authentic in a market that often rewarded conformity. Alexander found himself listening not as an investor, but as a man genuinely learning, drawn to her depth as much as her presence. After the galleries, Gabrielle led him uptown to Red Rooster in Harlem. The restaurant buzzed with conversation and music, live jazz flowing from a small stage, blending with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the sizzle of the kitchen. The energy was different from Chelsea, less curated, more immediate, more alive. Seated at a corner table, they ordered dishes steeped in history: fried chicken, collard greens, macaroni and cheese. Gabrielle relaxed slightly, sharing why she had agreed to the auction in the first place. "It wasn't vanity or exposure," she said, stirring her tea. "It was necessity. My grandmother's restaurant, my mother's bills. I needed a way to protect what mattered without losing myself." Alexander listened, nodding, sensing the balance she maintained between honesty and composure. "You were aware of the dynamics," he said quietly, "and you still chose to participate." She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, but there are lines I wouldn't cross. Being here doesn't mean compromising who I am. That's the distinction I hold dear." The conversation drifted from art to upbringing to the nuances of New York life. Each exchange revealed small truths about values, responsibility, and resilience. Chemistry built naturally, absent any pretense, even though the night had begun as a formal transaction. Alexander found himself intrigued by her convictions, inspired by her perspective, and increasingly aware of the unusual gravity of their connection. When the evening wound down, the streets of Harlem were quieter. They stepped outside, the city lights reflecting in puddles from an earlier rain. Gabrielle glanced at her watch, realizing the time, and offered a small, knowing smile. "Midnight already," she said softly. Alexander hesitated before speaking. "I don't want this to end." Her eyes met his. A mix of caution and curiosity mirrored in her expression. Neither could articulate the tension, the pull that had begun to define the night, but both understood that the evening had shifted from a formal obligation into something neither expected, but both wanted to explore further. Over the following 6 weeks, Gabrielle and Alexander's lives intersected in ways neither had anticipated. Their meetings took them across New York, each location revealing a new dimension of their worlds. In his Woolworth Building office, Gabrielle methodically examined the artworks Alexander had purchased for his corporate collection. She pointed out pieces that were technically proficient but lacked depth, explaining why certain choices felt hollow despite their high market value. He listened carefully, absorbing her perspective, and found himself reevaluating not only his collection, but the assumptions he had carried for years. The city's elite, he realized, often mistook price for meaning, prestige for authenticity. Gabrielle's insight forced him to confront his own blind spots without judgment, challenging the way he had always assigned value. They spent afternoons at the Brooklyn Museum in Crown Heights, exploring exhibitions that showcased contemporary Black artists. Sitting on the museum steps afterward, Gabrielle spoke candidly about the auction and her conflicted feelings. "Being on that stage, even for a cause I believe in, reminded me of how often people place value on women like objects. It's difficult to separate the charity from the commodification." Alexander nodded, absorbing the gravity of her words. He did not respond defensively. Instead, he reflected on the privileges he had always taken for granted and the ways his wealth had insulated him from similar realities. Their conversations continued in quieter settings. At Café Lalo on the Upper West Side, over coffee and soft chatter from neighboring tables, Gabrielle shared the rhythms of her childhood, the lessons learned from her mother and grandmother. In Central Park's conservatory garden, they exchanged stories of birthdays, first jobs, and small triumphs, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the city. Evenings at the Village Vanguard provided another layer to their connection. Music became a language beyond words, notes threading between them in a space where pretense could not survive. They absorbed the artistry together, experiencing subtle shifts in understanding and emotion without needing to articulate them. Through these weeks, their relationship evolved from a formal business arrangement into genuine friendship, and then into something neither could fully name. Both felt the tension of desire, but each was cautious, aware of the fragile foundation they were constructing. Their connection was real, yet untested, and the boundaries they had drawn around independence and dignity remained under quiet negotiation. Alexander found himself increasingly invested in her perspective, inspired by her courage to assert her values. Gabrielle, in turn, recognized a side of him that could listen, learn, and be present without attempting to control outcomes. It was an unfamiliar balance for both, one that required patience, honesty, and subtle vulnerability. As the 6 weeks drew on, it became clear that their meetings were no longer dictated by obligation or obligation alone. Each encounter carried the anticipation of discovery about the city, about art, and about each other. The sense of exchange had deepened beyond the transactional, yet neither could predict where it might lead. By the end of this period, they were bound not by contracts or societal expectation, but by curiosity, respect, and a tentative emotional investment. The transition from professional interaction to personal attachment was gradual but undeniable, leaving both to confront the question they had yet to voice. How much of themselves were they willing to risk in the pursuit of connection? Gabrielle's phone buzzed repeatedly as she sat across from Alexander in the small West Village Italian restaurant. Her grandmother's landlord had moved up the sale date for the building, and the required $400,000 hung over her like a storm she couldn't control. She stirred her pasta slowly, gathering courage before speaking. "I don't know how to handle this," she admitted quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "If I can't come up with the money, the restaurant will be gone. Everything my grandmother built, everything she sacrificed, gone." Alexander didn't hesitate. "Tell me the details. Let me help." Before she could respond, he pulled out his phone. "I can write a check tomorrow. Consider it done." Gabrielle's chest tightened. Relief mingled with an unexpected dread. "I can't accept that," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I won't be bought, Alexander. Not my time, not my grandmother's legacy, not my pride." His brow furrowed. "I'm not buying you. I'm helping. Why is this a problem?" She met his gaze steadily, frustration and hurt threading through her voice. "Because when help comes with a price, whether explicit or implied, it changes everything. I'd constantly wonder if my choices, my feelings, my work were influenced by your money. That's not partnership. That's control disguised as generosity." They left the restaurant together, their conversation continuing as they crossed the corner of Bleecker and McDougal. Voices rose, tension flaring in the cool night air. Alexander's instinct was to solve problems immediately, to make the numbers work, to fix outcomes. Gabrielle's instinct was to protect her autonomy, even if it meant facing hardship alone. When the argument reached its peak, both stepped back, hurt and exhausted. Gabrielle turned toward the subway and then to her car, her mind a mixture of fear and defiance. Alexander watched her walk away, a strange emptiness settling around him as the city lights blurred past. She spent the night walking along the Brooklyn Promenade, staring at the Manhattan skyline glittering across the East River. The city looked unchanged, vast and indifferent, yet her own life felt precarious. She questioned the stubborn pride that had always guided her, wondering if independence came at the cost of isolation. Meanwhile, Alexander returned to his Tribeca penthouse, the quiet weight of her words pressing in. The skyline was familiar, yet the emptiness he felt was new. The following morning, Caroline arrived, sensing his disquiet. "You tried to solve it with money," she said gently, pouring coffee. "That's what you know. But you can't buy your way into someone's heart, Alex. You can't replace trust or respect with a check." He looked out at the city, absorbing the truth of her words. He had always relied on his resources to create solutions, to protect, to impress. This time, none of that mattered. To show up, to be present, to support without controlling. That was the challenge he had never faced. For the first time, Alexander understood that some problems required patience and presence rather than capital. Gabrielle's pride was not an obstacle to overcome, but a boundary to respect. The work ahead would demand humility, honesty, and a willingness to confront his own impulses. The night had ended with no resolution, both of them retreating into their worlds, each left to wrestle with disappointment, longing, and questions of worth. The city pulsed around them, a reminder that life moved forward, but the challenge before them remained. Could connection thrive when independence and generosity collided? Alexander spent the 3 days after their argument in quiet reflection, pacing the perimeter of his Tribeca penthouse, reviewing the moments with Gabrielle over and over. He realized how often he had relied on wealth to create solutions without engaging with the human realities behind them. Checks and gestures could solve many problems, but they could not build trust, respect, or genuine connection. He understood now that if he truly valued Gabrielle, he needed to approach her world on her terms. On the 4th morning, he arrived at her grandmother's restaurant in Bed-Stuy. He left his tailored suit in the car and rolled up his sleeves, walking into a bustling kitchen filled with warmth, noise, and a comforting sense of purpose. Gabrielle glanced up from the counter, wary but attentive. "I'm here to help," he said quietly. "Not to buy anything, not to fix everything, just to be present." They moved through the lunch service together. Alexander washed dishes, refilled coffee, and served plates to regulars. He listened closely as patrons shared stories, memories of past meals, and opinions about the neighborhood. For the first time, he absorbed the value of a place and a community beyond financial metrics. Later, in the quiet of the kitchen, he found Gabrielle stacking plates. "I want to be your partner, not your patron," he said earnestly. "I've been trying to solve problems with money alone. That's not support. It never has been." Gabrielle studied him, measuring the sincerity in his tone. Partnership means showing up without expecting control. It means recognizing what someone has built and helping it grow on their terms, she replied. Together, they devised a new approach for the restaurant. Alexander introduced Gabrielle to investors interested in community-focused ventures, people who would support the business as collaborators rather than donors. Through his connections, Gabrielle's consulting business gained visibility among collectors who valued her expertise, offering contracts that respected both her skill and her integrity. Over the following weeks, Alexander maintained consistent presence. He assisted at the restaurant on busy weekends, attended gallery openings, and joined her at events where she showcased emerging artists. Each action emphasized partnership rather than charity, creating a rhythm of trust and mutual respect between them. As the restaurant began to stabilize under the new community investment model, Alexander and Gabrielle found their relationship shifting from transactional beginnings to authentic collaboration. The energy between them, once defined by uncertainty and obligation, now carried the subtle certainty of shared purpose. Each encounter reflected growing alignment of values, demonstrating that support did not require diminishing someone's independence. Through small, steady actions, Alexander began to understand what Gabrielle had known all along. True connection is measured not by what you provide, but by how you respect and empower the other person. By embracing this principle, he found himself growing alongside her, a partner in both the business and the personal sense of the word. Over the following months, Gabrielle and Alexander continued exploring the intersections of their lives, balancing familiarity with discovery. Gabrielle guided Alexander through neighborhoods that shaped her. Weekend visits to the Herbert von King Park cookouts, where neighbors shared food and stories, and Sunday services at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, where music and faith connected generations. Each experience allowed Alexander to observe culture and community in ways his wealth had never afforded. In turn, Alexander opened doors to opportunities that Gabrielle had long earned but lacked access to. He introduced her to collectors, gallery owners, and patrons who recognized her expertise without compromising her voice. She accepted these openings with care, preserving autonomy while benefiting from expanded visibility. The restaurant flourished under the community investment model. Regulars returned, drawn by continuity and renewed energy, while the local press highlighted the collaboration as a success story of entrepreneurship and cultural preservation. Gabrielle balanced her responsibilities at the restaurant with her consulting practice, which gained traction among high-profile clients who valued her integrity and insight. They navigated the realities of economic disparity openly. Conversations about expectations, resources, and boundaries became routine, reinforcing the mutual respect that had grown from the earliest weeks of their connection. Both were careful to avoid defaulting to power dynamics, treating disagreements as opportunities to communicate rather than dominate. Family integration deepened the connection. Alexander spent time with Gabrielle's grandmother and mother, learning the family's traditions, recipes, and values. Gabrielle, in turn, became closer to Caroline, appreciating her perspective on Alexander's personality and witnessing the sibling bond that had influenced his worldview. Together, they modeled a new approach to partnership. Their relationship became defined not by wealth, social status, or obligations, but by shared priorities, consistent engagement, and respect for individual contributions. The restaurant's revival became emblematic of that ethos, a tangible result of collaboration rather than singular investment. Through months of mutual effort, they built a rhythm in which both could thrive. Gabrielle maintained the authority she had always held in her work, while Alexander contributed resources, time, and attention without overshadowing her autonomy. Each encounter strengthened trust, demonstrating that connection across economic and social boundaries could succeed when rooted in intention and respect. By the end of this period, the neighborhood recognized the restaurant as a cultural and culinary anchor. Gabrielle's consulting practice continued to grow, and Alexander's engagement with her world had deepened his understanding of influence, patience, and humility. The partnership they had established extended beyond business and romance, reflecting the values that had guided Gabrielle through life and the lessons Alexander had learned in navigating them. The late afternoon sun stretched across the Manhattan skyline, turning the city golden as Gabrielle and Alexander walked along the Brooklyn Bridge. The winter air carried a crispness that made every inhale feel sharp, alive. Below them, the East River reflected the fading light, flowing steadily, unconcerned with the lives above it. "I keep thinking about that night at the auction," Alexander said, his voice quiet over the distant hum of traffic. "I thought I was bidding on a date. I had no idea I was bidding on the chance to become a better man." Gabrielle turned toward him, her expression calm, reflective. "And I thought I was selling my time for a cause. I didn't realize I was opening a door to partnership." They paused, leaning slightly on the railing, watching the river move between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Both recognized that the auction had brought them together, but it did not define them. It was only the first step in a longer journey, one that required effort, honesty, and constant negotiation. Alexander spoke again. "Every day we choose to show up, in small ways and big ways. Supporting without controlling, listening without assuming, contributing without diminishing. That's what makes it real." Gabrielle nodded. Partnership doesn't erase challenges. It asks for patience, dialogue, and the willingness to confront privilege openly. We'll make mistakes. We'll disagree. But we choose each other through it. She thought of the restaurant, now a thriving hub where the community gathered, and of her consulting business, flourishing with clients who respected her expertise. Alexander's presence in her life had opened doors, but it had never replaced the effort, skill, and commitment she had invested. Their hands brushed lightly, a reminder that connection required attention and care, not grand gestures or symbolic purchases. Love across their different worlds had been possible only because they approached it consciously, valuing communication, respect, and equality. They continued along the bridge, feeling the steady rhythm of the city beneath their feet. No dramatic epiphanies, no perfect resolutions, just a shared understanding of what it meant to build something lasting, something real. Their journey had begun in a moment of transaction, yet it had grown into a partnership grounded in trust, collaboration, and intentional choice. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Alexander glanced at Gabrielle. "This isn't a fairy tale," he said softly. "It's the start of building something that matters together." Gabrielle smiled, squeezing his hand. "And that's exactly the kind of story worth investing in." 1 year after the auction, Gabrielle's grandmother's restaurant celebrated its anniversary. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the warmth of familiar faces. Community members, artists, investors, and friends filled the space, honoring the revival of a place that represented more than food. It was a testament to resilience, culture, and collaboration. Gabrielle moved among the guests with calm assurance, her presence grounded in the work she had done to protect and grow the restaurant. Alexander accompanied her, attentive without dominating, facilitating introductions, and quietly observing the joy around them. Their connection was visible, defined not by displays of wealth or gestures, but by the consistency and integrity of their partnership. Reflecting on the past year, Gabrielle understood that her value was independent of external validation. Her skills, experience, and dedication had created worth beyond what money could measure. Alexander had learned that real partnership requires vulnerability, not control, offering support without diminishing someone else's achievements. They had discovered that independence and interdependence can coexist. Accepting help did not compromise Gabrielle's autonomy, just as providing resources did not grant Alexander authority over her decisions. Their ongoing conversations about privilege and power maintained balance, ensuring respect for each other's boundaries. The restaurant's continued success illustrated the strength of community investment over individual charity. Its growth and sustainability were the result of collective commitment, a legacy that extended beyond any one person's influence. Gabrielle's consulting business also flourished, attracting clients who valued her expertise while respecting her voice. As they stepped aside from the celebration, Gabrielle said softly, "It began with a transaction, but look at what we've created together." Alexander nodded. Sometimes the highest bidder doesn't buy you. They earn the privilege of standing beside you. Their story demonstrated that love, trust, and partnership require conscious effort. Value cannot be bought, dignity must be protected, and meaningful connections are built through intention, respect, and communication. Each had contributed in ways that honored the other's independence while fostering shared growth. To viewers, this story serves as a reminder. Success and connection demand presence, honesty, and collaboration. Recognizing contributions, navigating differences, and building together can transform initial transactions into authentic bonds. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and share where you're viewing from, because tomorrow brings another story that explores resilience, integrity, and the depth of human connection.